detectives arrived to interview the Israeli Prime Minister.
Benjamin Netanyahu fue interrogado 2 veces por la policía por casos de presunta corrupción.
עכשיו אנחנו מבקשים לעסוק בפרשת נתניהו ולא עם מוזס הבוקר.
Accused of trying to essentially bribe a newspaper.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. Benjamin Netanyahu under investigation for corruption. The tale of the tape and the art of the deal that puts the lie to the Prime Minister's media narrative. In Zimbabwe, what is more delicate, the health of the 92-year-old president or the way the media tiptoe around the story? It's how BuzzFeed seized the job of reporters in 2017, and it's what Donald Trump calls fake news.
Because we're getting quite a bit of inaccurate news.
Israelis have known for a month now that their Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has been questioned in a possible corruption case. This past week, they learned that part of that investigation involves the country's 2 biggest newspapers and audio tapes that sound like a smoking gun. The 2 papers are Yediat Ahronot, which used to be Israel's most widely circulated publication, and Israel Hayom, a free paper that is now the most widely read in the country, and is a story in and of itself because it is so influential and so pro-Netanyahu that Israelis like to call it Bibiton, Bibi's paper. The audio tapes come from meetings held in 2014 between Netanyahu and Yediat Ahronot's owner, Arnon Moses, who the Prime Minister has often accused of persecuting him. But on the tape, Netanyahu suggests that if Moses and his paper cover him more favorably, his government could find ways of limiting Israel Hayom's distribution, and that would be good for Moses' paper. Benjamin Netanyahu has more than a passing interest in the news media. He doubles as Israel's communications minister, often personally attacks journalists whose work he does not like, and has crafted a narrative that he is the victim of a biased and hostile press. Politicians everywhere try to manipulate the media for their own purposes, but this story puts a master manipulator like Netanyahu on another level. He looks less like a victim of the media and more like a puppet master pulling the strings. Our starting point this week is the Israeli capital, Tel Aviv.
התקשורת בישראל תוקפת את ראש הממשלה יותר מכל תקשורת אחרת בעולם. מה שלא הצליחו לעשות בקלפי מנסים לעשות בניפוח תקשורתי אדיר. Even the Prime Minister has the right to criticize the press, which I just did.
The bad blood between Netanyahu and all the media is not a new story. It started when he entered politics almost 30 years ago. And this conversation created an earthquake in Israel, mostly because it's 2 enemies in the political field.
And the new details, and I'm looking at my mobile as we speak, the new details are that Moses, the media magnate, is saying to Netanyahu, I will do anything that you will be the prime minister as long as you want. That's from his side. Prime Minister promises to the publisher, I will make sure that Israel Hayom, the newspaper which is basically a propaganda arm of Netanyahu, will not be a free newspaper anymore, and for this newspaper, it's basically a death verdict.
So we are talking here about the Prime Minister of Israel, who is doing a deal with his most critical rival in the Israeli media at the price of cutting down the newspaper that was created for him.
There were 2 participants at the meeting in question, 2 voices on the tape, the Prime Minister and the owner of Yediat Ahronot. However, this story is really about another paper, Israel Hayom, which is bankrolled by Sheldon Adelson, an American casino billionaire who started the paper in 2007 when Benjamin Netanyahu was out of office trying to get back in. Israel Hayom is a free paper and from the start was relentlessly pro-Netanyahu. By 2010, just 3 years after launch, it was the country's biggest. Some papers occasionally operate in the red. Israel Hayom lives there. It reportedly loses close to $30 million a year, or, put another way, about 1 Israeli shekel for every paper printed. Clearly, its owner can live with that as part of the price of doing politics, but others cannot. That is why, in 2014, a new piece of legislation came before the Knesset, which would have outlawed money-losing newspapers with political agendas, like Adelson's, as threats to Israel's democracy. But the so-called Israel Hayom law was never passed because Prime Minister Netanyahu called a snap election first.
The timing of the decision to go to election just after the first reading of the Israel Hayom bill, but before the final stages of legislation were moved. The fact that he chose to fire two ministers who had supported the legislation ensured the fact that the Knesset would be dissolved and the country would go to elections. That does indicate that this was a major motive for Netanyahu for going to elections at that time.
For Netanyahu, it was a threat for his political life. Just don't touch Israel Hayom. That's basically Netanyahu's logic. So Israel went to elections on the question of media and who gets to control public opinion.
What no one knew until this past week is that in the year prior to that election call, Prime Minister Netanyahu made his offer to Yediat Ahronot's owner, Arnon Moses, that in exchange for more positive coverage, the government would no longer allow Israel Hayom to be a free paper. Even with Sheldon Adelson and the country's most widely read publication firmly in his corner, Netanyahu spends a lot of time complaining about the Israeli media. He has taken to writing letters to reporters he deems hostile, challenging them to make the letters public, and some have. However, the new revelations, the meeting with Moses, the offer made, show the Prime Minister to be more than what he says he is, a victim of biased journalism. Netanyahu offered to alter the country's newspaper landscape to suit his own political agenda. And that's just for starters.
Netanyahu is obsessed over media for many years. And he has a very strong perception on how media should look like. Because of that, he took the position of Minister of Communication. Because of that, he forced all his coalition partners that only what he decides will happen in the field of media, and is really obsessed and determined to implement these changes in media in Israel in order that he will have a larger share of voice and much less strong and independent journalism.
For example, he wants to split down Channel 2, which is too powerful, to two smaller channels. He is trying to destroy or to prevent the launching of the new broadcast corporation, which is supposed to replace Israel Broadcasting Authority, because he's afraid that the new corporation would be less supportive to the government. So there is a sense that he's trying to change the media map in Israel.
Because he knows that there is a large section in the population which doesn't like the media, and he can use that to be seen as the victim.
היחיד שהחליטו לאסור עליו לדבר בתקשורת זה אני.
He can use that to gain more popularity. He can use it to neutralize the media's power. So for all those reasons, whether he actually believes it or whether it's a tactic used, it's still the right thing for him to do.
Which adds another element to the coverage of the corruption investigation of Prime Minister Netanyahu, which was already a tantalizing story for the Fourth Estate. But it's not just about the politician, Israel's media critic-in-chief, and the press barons. Ultimately, this story is about the state of the news media in Israel and the implications for journalists there.
We're talking about Netanyahu and Moses, and it seems like a drama worthwhile watching, as if it's a personal battle between two people. But we really need to think seriously about the implication of what does this story mean? How are information channels, those that are supposed to tell us what's happening, are basically polluted. They are heavily polluted. There are two victims to this scandal. The first one is the public. The second one is the journalists. Where can we work? You know, which media outlet is worthwhile for a journalist to work in? If you want to be a print journalist in Israel, you really don't have a lot of places to go, and that is, I think, a sad thing.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week. The response tweeted by Donald Trump was typical in that it ended with an exclamation mark. Fake news, a total political witch hunt. And in this case, the U.S. president-elect may actually have a point. The story was about a series of allegations that would be huge if true. CNN got the ball rolling with some tantalizing bits that it aired about Russian intelligence officers having a dossier on Trump.
Compromising personal and financial information about Mr. Trump.
Then BuzzFeed went all in on the story, publishing the alleged classified dossier, simultaneously admitting that the allegations were not only unverified, but potentially unverifiable. The dossier also contained some clear factual errors. BuzzFeed's editor tried to preempt the critical pounding that he knew was coming by saying that the site decided to publish the material so that Americans can make up their own minds about allegations about the president-elect that have circulated at the highest levels of the U.S. government. The Guardian in the UK says that it was among the media outlets that received the documents as well, but declined to publish them. And as Wolfgang Blau, former Guardian editor now with Condé Nast, put it, rare that a story stinks from every possible angle. The source, the content, the consequence, the messenger, the target. Facebook has made a new hire, someone to lead what it calls its news partnership team, which works with news outlets that publish their content on the site. And she comes from the world of the mainstream news media. Campbell Brown is a former anchor at both NBC and CNN who says of her new job, right now we are watching a massive transformation take place in the news business, both in the way people consume news and in the way reporters disseminate news. Facebook is a major part of this transformation. The company has been accused of doing too little to counter fake news reports, particularly during the U.S. election campaign. What Facebook calls news hoaxes will fall under Brown's brief, among other things. Within the space of a few days, 5 human rights activists have gone missing in Pakistan, and those calling for their safe return are making no bones about it. They're saying that the government is probably behind the disappearances. Demonstrators came out in Islamabad on behalf of academic Salman Haidar and bloggers Waqas Goraya, Asim Saeed, and Ahmad Raza Nasir. The NGO Human Rights Watch said all 4 men were vocal critics of militant religious groups in Pakistan's military establishment and used the internet to disseminate their views. Their near-simultaneous disappearance and the government shutting down of their websites and blogs raises grave concerns of government involvement. A 5th activist, Samar Abbas, from the anti-extremism group Civil Progressive Alliance Pakistan, has also gone missing since then. When the Interior Ministry initially said that it would investigate, Dawn, Pakistan's leading English-language newspaper, said the government cannot hide an ugly truth. The state of Pakistan continues to be suspected of involvement in the disappearance and illegal detentions of a range of private citizens. Robert Mugabe has ruled Zimbabwe for nearly 37 years, and at age 92 is the world's oldest sitting president. But talking about his age and a possible political succession can land Zimbabwean journalists in trouble. It's a difficult topic to ignore, given that Mugabe's ZANU-PF is divided as party members vie for position or align themselves with potential successors. State-owned news outlets like the Herald newspaper and the Zimbabwean Broadcasting Corporation remain loyal to Mugabe, but even they appear to be backing one faction in the ZANU-PF, albeit indirectly, by attacking the other. All of this maneuvering comes on the back of last year's civil unrest, the biggest anti-government demonstration seen in Zimbabwe for years, which slowly but surely faded away. The social media movement, so instrumental in calling people out onto the streets, largely went silent. The question is why. The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now from Zimbabwe, where the big issue for the country's news media is what comes next.
These are uncertain times in Zimbabwe, unstable times. Last year, the anti-government protests were the biggest the country had seen in years. Unemployment is rife, infrastructure is crumbling, and the failing economy has been compounded by a cash crisis. And the aging president, Robert Mugabe, is unwilling to make way for a successor. So, last month, when the ruling party, Mugabe's ZANU-PF, held its annual conference, it needed a strong story to come out of the event. The same local reporters the government had been turning the screws on were present in force to cover the gathering. And after waiting for our accreditation for 4 months, the listening post finally got in. Among Mugabe's messages, he did not want the media meddling with the country's political future.
For goodness sake, it doesn't help getting the newspapers to intervene in our quarrels and disagreements.
There's a growing political divide, a split in the ZANU-PF, and Zimbabwe's newspapers appear to be choosing sides. The state-owned Herald, the most widely circulated paper in the country, is backing one faction headed by Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa at the expense of cabinet ministers from the other side.
They are targeting 3 ministers. The Minister of Higher Education, Jonathan Moyo, who is also former information minister at one time. There is the President's nephew, Patrick Joao, who was Minister of Youth, and the Minister of Local Government, Xavier Kasukwere. These ministers in the past 3 months have been attacked by the public media in a way that we have never seen before.
Privately owned papers like Newsday and The Standard have been less obvious than The Herald, but their coverage is more favorable to a faction that includes Education Minister Jonathan Moyo. Moyo generates much of his own news. He uses Twitter to take on his ZANU-PF rivals, creating a social media spectacle that has left President Mugabe unimpressed.
We do not run or organize matters of the party or settle our grievances through Twitter and Facebook, etc., whatever.
There is no other ZANU-PF minister who is tweeting except Professor Jonathan Moyo. It is clear who is at the forefront of using Twitter to attack opponents, even to attack the media, to attack even the Herald. If we write something that he doesn't agree with, he's quick to attack us. Whenever we do a story, we do not make the mistake of not conducting them, but sometimes they do not take our calls.
That political struggles are reflected in the media is not a new phenomenon in Zimbabwe. What is unusual is the frequency of attacks on ZANU-PF ministers in state media, which signals to many that those news outlets are starting to align themselves with a likely successor. Criticizing the president still remains off limits. Any questions over his age, health, capacity to lead are left to privately owned newspapers. But those journalists need to proceed with caution. In early December, a video of Mugabe apparently struggling to leave the podium after a speech went viral. The privately owned weekly paper, The Standard, sent a reporter to speak with the information minister about the incident.
When the minister was asked about the president's health, he became very hostile. He asked the reporter who had sent him to ask those questions. This explains the kind of relationship that we have with the Minister of Information. They suspect that the private media is pushing a foreign agenda against the president.
African culture, especially here in Zimbabwe, is very averse to discussing a person's ill health, especially someone of that age. So you see a lot of the time whenever the president is in public, there is a huge focus on trying to establish how much longer he has to live. And I think obviously ZANU-PF has an interest in, leaving that discussion out completely.
The private media claim that there's closure of democratic space in Zimbabwe. But honestly, if I had to do a content analysis of what comes out in these papers, the way they call the president names, the way they call the first family names, people are free to say what they want.
The government does give privately owned newspapers some leeway, but only because they have a limited reach in the country. Far more people get their news from broadcast media, where the state-controlled Zimbabwean Broadcasting Corporation has a near monopoly. ZBC is the only domestic TV channel in the country, and it stays on message. The few privately owned radio stations are mostly loyal to the ZANU-PF. It was social media that caught the ruling party off guard last year when a wave of anti-government protests was sparked by a video posted on Facebook.
It feels as if I just want to belong to another country. This flag.
The video, uploaded by a pastor named Ivan Mawarire, launched a social media movement called #ThisFlag, and multiple others followed. Activists relied on phone technology to spread the word and get people onto the streets. But as the movements grew, the state machinery was deployed in full force and the demonstrations were put down.
You had riot police You had the army in some instances. People started getting arrested. People started getting beaten up, and they were very indiscriminate in their attacks on the populace. There was one video that went viral of a woman, who was, raising her hands up in surrender, and they beat her to a pulp.
These online movements, they used WhatsApp to organize people. So when the government started threatening that they can seize people's phones, people started fearing that maybe they will be arrested.
Pastor Ivan leaving the country was a huge blow to the movement, and I think the whole aspect of the movement was around a phrase saying "Hati chachka, hati chada," which means we're not afraid anymore and we don't want anymore. So him leaving kind of contradicted that statement, and it kind of brought back, the fear amongst people.
Last week, Zimbabwe's telecom authority issued a directive to mobile phone networks that effectively pushed up the cost of data from $1 for 250 megabytes to $1 for just 10 megabytes. It looks like the government is trying to price Zimbabweans out of social media, because last year the tactic worked. Back in August, at the height of the protests, the Mugabe government reportedly issued a temporary ban on mobile phone networks offering data bundles, the promotional packages that make data more affordable. With the country experiencing a cash shortage that has citizens queuing at bank machines for hours on end, and withdrawal limits set as low as $50 a day in some cases, Zimbabweans need to prioritize where they spend their money. So as the price of data went up, engagement with the social media movements went down.
People focused on their daily needs, and buying data wasn't a priority anymore. So we had a significant drop in viewership, significant drop in impressions on Twitter, significant drop in reach on Facebook. That is when the whole social media movements, the hashtag movements, started to die.
It's a platform for the elite, but when it comes to the crunch, is the grannies, the grandpas, the men and women in the village who always deliver the vote for ZANU-PF. ZANU-PF always does badly in urban areas where these people who have access to social media are. So these people who are doing these social media campaigns are basically preaching to the converted. It's of no effect to ZANU-PF.
Nearly 37 years into the rule of Robert Mugabe, his power remains entrenched, and no opposition in politics or the media have been able to dislodge him. So while some news outlets prepare for who comes next, today it's President Mugabe and his government wants to keep it that way, even if they have to hit Zimbabweans where it already hurts. And that, for now, is the Zimbabwean story.
Finally, getting back to our lead story, during the 2015 Israeli election campaign, Benjamin Netanyahu's team produced a video about the news media. It has a political aide repeatedly running into the prime minister's office equipped with the latest offensive headlines, some of which are fake. In the video, there are two news sources quoted, Yediat Ahronot and its online platform Ynet. However, if you look closely, you'll see that the masthead of Yediat Ahronot, which in Hebrew means recent reports, has been changed to Lying Report, and that Ynet is called Lynet. Considering that the video was released just a few months after Netanyahu was in those secret negotiations with Yediat Ahronot, it does make you wonder whether the peace talks were doomed from the start. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
Mr. President, Israel is acting to defend its security.
אדוני ראש הממשלה, יש פרשה חדשה. נתניהו והשבלולים בגינה.
מה?
ראש הממשלה, פרשת הכוסות המלוכלכות בכיור. זה בליינט.
נו, באמת.
ראש הממשלה, יש פרשייה חדשה.
נו, מה עכשיו?
הארטיק שטפטף על הספה.
אוי.
ראש הממשלה, פרשת הדגים הרעבים. והצמאים.
אבל אני מאכיל אותם כל יום.
ראש הממשלה, פרשת המזגן המרעיש לשכנים. אני מחבק, כן? ראש הממשלה, פרשת השיחות שלא נענו. פרשת השולחן המתנדנד, פרשת הבום בפריים.
טוב, די. הם רוצים להסיט את תשומת הלב שלכם מהדברים החשובים באמת ולעסוק בשטויות. אבל אנחנו עוסקים בדברים החשובים. מי ישמור על ביטחון ילדינו? מי יצמיח את הכלכלה שלנו? זהו אנחנו או הם. ואתם יודעים, זה אנחנו. רק הליכוד.
ראש הממשלה רוצה לשתות משהו?
אתה יודע מה? דווקא בא לי גלידה, אבל לא פיסטוק.